By the time the last cup was washed and placed upside down on the draining board, the kitchen had already begun to look like itself again. That was the troubling thing about small English kitchens. They restored their ordinary appearance with unseemly speed, as though nothing of interest could ever truly disturb them. Mrs. Edith Lancombe stood at the sink longer than necessary, her hands resting in the cooling water, her gaze fixed on the narrow window above the sill. Outside, the lane lay empty. The delivery van had gone, the vicar's wife had gone, even Mrs. Pell from next door, who rarely missed an opportunity to linger, had made her polite excuses and left. Only the taste remained. It was not dramatic. There had been no collapse, no spilling of tea, no sharp intake of breath, just a hesitation, a pause so slight that, had Mrs. Lancombe been younger or less practiced at noticing herself, she might have dismissed it entirely. The jam, spread generously on buttered bread, had not tasted wrong exactly. It had tasted uncertain, as though it had once been something else, and had not quite decided whether to admit it. She had smiled, of course. One did not accuse a homemade gift of anything on a first mouthful. Now alone, she dried her hands carefully and crossed to the dresser. The jar sat where it had been placed earlier, label turned outward in a conscientious hand, plum and ginger, September. The handwriting was unmistakable. Everyone in the village knew it. It belonged to Miss Harriet Crowell, who had been making jam longer than anyone could quite remember, and took a quiet pride in the fact. Mrs. Lancombe did not touch the jar. She did not need to. She had already reached a conclusion, not about the jam, but about herself. Whatever this was, it would not improve by fuss. Up the lane, Inspector Purbright adjusted his hat against the faint but persistent drizzle. He had arrived not in response to a summons, but because he had promised himself, quite without witnesses, that he would walk rather than take the car whenever the village allowed it. It was an indulgence he justified as observation. Walking, he believed, taught one how people expected to be seen. The Lancombes' cottage had been visible for several minutes before he reached it, the brickwork softened by damp, the windows reflecting a pale, undecided sky. Nothing about it suggested urgency. That, too, was worth noting. Mrs. Lancombe moved the jam jar half an inch to the left. The adjustment pleased her more than it should have. She poured herself another cup of tea and sat, not at the table but in the narrow chair by the range, where the warmth pressed gently against her legs. She did not drink. The taste still occupied her mouth with an obstinacy she found faintly insulting. She reviewed the afternoon in order. The knock at the door, Miss Crowell's upright figure framed against the lane, parcel held firmly, voice brisk but not unkind. The vicar's wife arriving moments later, apologizing before her coat was removed. The three of them seated, knees angled politely away from one another, conversation proceeding along familiar grooves. Weather, fruit yields, the price of sugar, nothing improper, nothing remarkable. And yet, the inspector's boots made a small decisive sound on the stone path. Mrs. Lancombe heard it and felt a brief, unreasonable relief, followed immediately by annoyance at herself for feeling it. She rose and opened the door before he could knock. "Inspector," she said, with the tone of someone acknowledging coincidence rather than intention. "Mrs. Lancombe," he replied, inclining his head. His manner today was lightly amused, as though the world had offered him something earlier and he had decided not to keep it to himself. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said, which was true in a way she could not yet have explained. "You've missed tea, I'm afraid." "A constant risk," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. His eyes travelled without haste around the kitchen, the cups, the chair by the range, the jam jar on the dresser, label facing outward. He noticed everything in the manner of a man who preferred others not to notice that he did so. Mrs. Lancombe waited. She had learned over the years that silence, used carefully, often saved one from unnecessary explanation. "You look," he said at last, "as though something has disappointed you." She considered denying it. Instead, she crossed the room, took the jar from the dresser, and set it between them on the table. "It's only jam," she said, "and perhaps it's me." Inspector Purbright examined the label with polite interest but did not open it. "Things that are only something," he observed, "often prove more demanding than expected." Outside, the drizzle thickened, tapping gently against the glass. The village continued its business. unaware that anything at all had shifted. Mrs. Lancombe watched the inspector's hands, careful not to touch the jar, and realized that he had already understood something she had not yet spoken aloud. The taste lingered still, patient and unresolved, waiting for permission to explain itself at last. The kitchen altered its character once the door had closed behind Inspector Purbright, as kitchens often did when left to their owners. Mrs. Lancombe remained where she was for a moment, her hand resting on the table edge, listening to the inspector's footsteps recede along the path and dissolve into the broader silence of the lane. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of pause, as though the room itself were waiting to be told what to do next. She lifted the jam jar from the table and returned it to the dresser, aligning it with unnecessary precision beside the flour tin. The label faced forward again, the curling corner smoothed flat with her thumb. She disliked untidiness, but she disliked suggestion more, and the jar seemed full of it. The kettle had cooled. She filled it anyway and set it on the hob, finding comfort in the familiar gesture, even as she knew she did not want more tea. When the kettle clicked off, she poured the water away without using it. Steam briefly fogged the window, blurring the lane into a pale wash of grey and green. For a moment she imagined the village disappearing entirely, leaving only the kitchen and the decisions contained within it. The thought did not alarm her as much as it should have. She sat at the table and folded her hands. The taste had faded but not vanished. It hovered at the edge of awareness like a word withheld. She considered the order of departures earlier that afternoon, Miss Crowell first, brisk and efficient, parcel already gone from her hands, the vicar's wife lingering, apologizing twice for staying and once more for leaving, Mrs. Pell arriving later than expected, having clearly intended to come earlier and then thought better of it. Each movement had seemed ordinary. Now they rearranged themselves in her mind with quiet insistence. A light knock came at the back door. Mrs. Lancombe sighed, then rose. Mrs. Pell stood there again, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright with the effort of restraint. She held up empty hands. She had forgotten her gloves. They lay on the chair where Mrs. Lancombe had noticed them earlier and deliberately left them. Mrs. Pell retrieved them and lingered, glancing toward the dresser, then away. She remarked that the inspector had looked serious. Mrs. Lancombe replied that he usually did. The exchange satisfied Mrs. Pell, who left with the sense of having confirmed something without naming it. Alone again, Mrs. Lancombe felt the room settle without fully returning to itself. The clock ticked too loudly. The range gave a small cooling click. She found herself thinking of Miss Crowell's pantry, remembered from years before, shelves labelled and aligned. Miss Crowell believed in control as a virtue, not from distrust of others but from faith in herself. Dusk crept in without ceremony. The light thinned, revealing dust on the sill that daylight had forgiven. Mrs. Lancombe switched on the lamp and was annoyed by how ordinary it made everything look. She prepared a simple supper and ate without appetite, listening between mouthfuls to the life outside. A gate closing, footsteps passing, a voice calling and then stopping. The village continued, attentive yet unalarmed. Later she washed up, dried the plates carefully, and stacked them with a precision that bordered on ritual. When she finished, she stood with the cloth in her hands, uncertain where to put it, then folded it and set it aside. The decision felt larger than it was. Before leaving the kitchen, she went to the dresser and moved the jam jar again, this time placing it behind the tins where it could not be seen without effort. The act did not feel dishonest. It felt prudent. She turned off the light and went upstairs, leaving the kitchen to the dark, trusting it to keep its own counsel until morning, and understanding that whatever had entered her house that afternoon would not leave as quietly as it had arrived. She paused on the stairs, listening, aware of how sound traveled differently at night, softened yet more insistent. From above came the quiet ticking of the landing clock, a counterpoint to the one below, marking the same time twice as if to ensure it would not be disputed. Mrs. Lancombe considered whether to fetch the jar once more, to examine it properly, to taste again under better light. She rejected the idea with a firmness that surprised her. Repetition, she knew, was how small uncertainties grew into habits. Instead, she resolved to pay attention elsewhere, to voices, to pauses, to the minor adjustments people made when they believed themselves unobserved. The village offered such details freely to those who looked without staring. Tomorrow she would call at the post office again, perhaps linger at the baker's, accept conversation without encouraging it. None of this felt like investigation, and she would have resisted the word if offered. It felt like housekeeping of a broader sort, the maintenance of shared surfaces and unspoken agreements. As she reached the landing, she felt steadier, not because answers were near, but because she had decided how to wait for them, and waiting, done properly, was something she had practiced for years. The decision settled quietly, bringing with it a modest confidence that tomorrow's conversations would reveal themselves in time, without urging. If she listened with the care the village demanded and accepted what followed naturally, then morning entered the village without ceremony, sliding between hedges and curtains as though it had always been expected. Mrs. Lancombe woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the house declare itself awake in small ways. The pipes sighed, a floorboard shifted. Nothing suggested urgency, yet she rose with the faint sense that something had already begun. Downstairs, the kitchen looked unchanged. The dresser was orderly, the table bare, the chair pushed in. She noticed at once that her eyes went not to the window or the kettle, but to the place where the jam jar had been hidden the night before. She did not retrieve it. Instead, she filled the kettle, lit the hob and waited, hands folded as the water warmed. When she drank her tea, the taste did not return. This absence felt temporary, like a courtesy extended rather than reassurance offered. By 9 o'clock she had decided to go out, not because she required anything but because remaining indoors would be remarked upon. In villages, stillness was interpreted as intention. She took her coat and stepped into the lane, locking the door carefully behind her. The air smelled of damp earth and early baking. Somewhere a radio played faintly, then stopped. She had gone only a short distance when she met Miss Crowell approaching from the opposite direction, basket on her arm, posture unaltered by the years. The encounter felt inevitable. They greeted one another with mutual politeness and no surprise. "I trust the jar travelled well," Miss Crowell said. "It did," Mrs. Lancombe replied. The answer was accurate without being complete. Miss Crowell nodded, apparently satisfied. They walked together for several steps, their pace similar but not quite matched. Miss Crowell spoke of fruit that had ripened unevenly, of lids that no longer sealed as reliably as they once had. The explanation was thorough and unsolicited. Miss Lancombe listened, noting how carefully it was offered. At the corner, Miss Crowell stopped. "One never knows how things will be received," she said lightly. "No," Mrs. Lancombe agreed. "One doesn't." They parted. Mrs. Lancombe continued on, feeling the weight of the exchange settle behind her like a closed door. The post office was busy enough to require patience. Mrs. Pell stood near the counter, examining stamps with unnecessary care. She glanced at Mrs. Lancombe and smiled, then leaned closer. "I hear the inspector was about," she said quietly. "He was," Mrs. Lancombe replied. Mrs. Pell nodded, as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "People do worry," she said. "They do," Mrs. Lancombe agreed. No more was said, yet the words lingered. By the time Mrs. Lancombe left the shop, she was aware of a subtle shift. Conversations paused when she entered, resumed when she passed. No one asked questions. They did not need to. A gift had been given. An obligation had followed. She returned home just before noon. The kitchen greeted her neutrally. She set down her bag and stood for a moment, considering the jar. Then the knock came. Inspector Purbright stood on the step, hat in hand, expression politely unreadable. "I wondered if you might walk with me," he said. Nothing formal, she agreed at once. Refusal would have been noticed. They walked toward the green at an unhurried pace. At first he spoke of ordinary things, the council's fondness for improvement, the state of the footpaths. She answered appropriately, aware that this was preparation rather than conversation. "Gifts," he said eventually, as though continuing a thought already shared. "They bind people in curious ways. They create expectations," she said. "Sometimes without consent," he added. She told him then about the taste, plainly and without emphasis. He listened without interruption, nodding once. When she finished, he did not respond immediately. "And Miss Crowell?" he asked at last. "She would never intend harm." Mrs. Lancome said, then paused. But intention isn't the same as responsibility. No, he said quietly. It rarely is. They parted at the green. Mrs. Lancome returned home alone, aware that something had been set in motion. Inside, she went to the dresser and brought the jam jar back into view, placing it where it could not be ignored. Obligations, she decided, were best met openly. The village would expect no less, and neither, she realized, would she. The village had a way of offering itself all at once a decision had been made, though no one ever admitted when that decision occurred. By the afternoon, Mrs. Lancome found herself receiving visitors who claimed coincidence with a confidence that suggested rehearsal. Each arrived with a purpose that was declared only after a period of polite evasion. Mrs. Pell came first, carrying a small basket of eggs she insisted were surplus. She spoke at length about hens and weather, circling her real interest with careful patience. Her eyes moved repeatedly toward the dresser, where the jam jar now stood in plain view. She did not comment on it. Instead, she remarked on Miss Crowell's dedication to preserving things past their season, a statement framed as admiration, but weighted with something less generous. Mrs. Lancome listened without encouragement, accepting the eggs and nothing else. Later came Mr. Hargreaves from 2 doors down, delivering a loaf he claimed had risen too much for his liking. He lingered awkwardly, remarking that gifts could be burdensome if misunderstood. He spoke as though this were a general truth, not a pointed one. Mrs. Lancome thanked him and made no reply beyond courtesy. When he left, he looked faintly disappointed. As the afternoon wore on, generosity accumulated on the kitchen table in small, unwanted quantities. Jam was met with bread, eggs with butter, nothing asked for, nothing refused. Each offering carried with it an expectation of acknowledgement, if not repayment. Mrs. Lancome felt herself becoming a ledger. She noticed that no one mentioned the inspector directly. His presence was referred to obliquely, as something that had passed through the village air and altered it slightly. People spoke more carefully, pauses lengthened, opinions were offered tentatively, withdrawn quickly if they landed too close to certainty. Miss Crowell herself did not appear. This absence was remarked upon with false casualness. Mrs. Lancome wondered whether it was deliberate. Miss Crowell understood the weight of timing better than most. By early evening, the kitchen felt crowded despite being empty. Mrs. Lancome stood at the sink, washing dishes she had not dirtied, listening to the village move outside her walls. Voices passed, doors opened and closed. Somewhere a radio played, then fell silent. She dried her hands and looked again at the jam jar. It had become an object of shared awareness, no longer hers alone. There was a knock she had not anticipated. Inspector Purbright stood at the door, hat in hand, his expression neutral but attentive. "I thought I'd call," he said. "It's been a busy day." "It has," she agreed. He stepped inside and surveyed the kitchen with mild interest, taking in the table, the baskets, the jar. "Generous," he observed. "Unreliably so," she replied. He smiled faintly. "That's often the case. Gifts can be invitations as much as offerings." They spoke quietly, not about accusations but about habits. Who gave what? Who lingered? Who avoided notice? Mrs. Lancome found herself recounting details she had not intended to share, trusting his attention without quite knowing why. Outside, dusk settled again. The inspector rose to leave, pausing by the door. "People don't always give to help," he said. "Sometimes they give to be included." After he left, Mrs. Lancome stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of goodwill. She understood then that generosity, once unreliable, became a form of pressure. The village had begun to lean, gently but insistently, toward an explanation, and she, by receiving so much, had placed herself at its center. Mrs. Lancome had not intended to take tea that afternoon. The decision formed itself quietly, as many of her decisions did, and then refused to be undone. By the time the kettle was filled and set upon the hob, she was already aware that the moment was ill-chosen, though she could not yet have said why. The kitchen, still crowded with the remnants of other people's generosity, seemed to hold its breath. She arranged the cups with care, selecting the plain ones rather than those reserved for visitors of consequence. This, too, felt deliberate. The act of choosing something ordinary suggested control, and control was in short supply. Outside, The village moved with its usual discretion, footsteps passing without pause, voices lowered when they neared her gate. The kettle began to murmur. She waited, hands folded, listening. It was then that the knock came, not sharp, not hesitant, but perfectly timed to interrupt without appearing to do so. Mrs. Lancombe closed her eyes briefly before answering. Mrs. Bellows stood on the step, wrapped in a coat that was too heavy for the season, her expression composed but alert. She had lived in the village long enough to know when tea would be offered, and she stepped inside without waiting to be asked. "I was passing," Mrs. Bellows said, as though the explanation mattered. "Of course," Mrs. Lancombe replied. They sat. Tea was poured. The kettle clicked off a moment too late, its protest filling the pause between them. Mrs. Bellows added milk before tasting, a habit she had never altered, and sighed with satisfaction. "One never knows when it's the right time," she said. "No," Mrs. Lancombe agreed. They spoke first of nothing. The weather, a leak in the church roof, someone's nephew, who would not settle. Beneath it all ran a careful awareness, a shared understanding that this was not a social call in the usual sense. Mrs. Bellows's eyes strayed repeatedly to the dresser. The jam jar remained where it had been placed, visible now, no longer concealed. Its presence altered the balance of the room. "I hear there have been questions," Mrs. Bellows said eventually. "Questions are common," Mrs. Lancombe replied. "Answers less so." Mrs. Bellows smiled thinly. "Miss Crowell has always been generous." "She has," Mrs. Lancombe said, and allowed the statement to rest where it landed. The tea cooled. Mrs. Lancombe drank without enjoyment, aware that each sip seemed to mark time rather than pass it. When Mrs. Bellows left, she did so with reluctance, as though aware she had arrived slightly too late to matter. No sooner had the door closed than another knock followed. This time it was Mr. Dawkins, breathless from walking too quickly, carrying a small tin he insisted contained biscuits he could not possibly finish alone. He spoke rapidly, nervously, filling the kitchen with words that avoided meaning. Mrs. Lancombe accepted the tin and offered tea again, though she knew she should not. They drank in strained silence. Mr. Dawkins glanced at the jam jar and looked away. "People talk," he said, as though confessing a weakness. "They do," she said. When he left, the kitchen felt heavier. Tea, she realized, had fixed the moment rather than eased it. By sitting, by pouring, by accepting company, she had allowed speculation to settle. The wrong moment had been chosen, and now it could not be undone. As the afternoon faded, she found herself replaying each exchange, noting the hesitations, the glances, the things left unsaid. Tea, taken too early or too late, revealed more than it concealed. The village had noticed, and noticing led inevitably to conclusion. She stood and cleared the cups, moving slowly, deliberately. Outside, the light softened, drawing longer shadows across the lane. Somewhere nearby, a door closed with quiet finality. Mrs. Lancombe paused by the dresser and looked at the jam jar once more. It sat unchanged, indifferent to timing or propriety, exerting its quiet influence. She understood then that the mistake had not been the tea itself, but the moment she allowed it to be shared. In villages, timing was a language of its own, and she had spoken too soon. The knowledge settled with an unwelcome clarity. Whatever followed would be shaped not by what had been said, but by when it had been offered, and the village, attentive as ever, would remember the timing precisely. The meeting took place, as it always did, in the back room of the parish hall, where the smell of polish never quite masked the older scent of sugar and fruit. Mrs. Lancombe arrived a few minutes early, which she suspected would be noticed later by those who arrived precisely on time. Chairs had already been set in a loose circle, close enough to suggest familiarity, far enough apart to preserve discretion. Miss Crowell stood at the long table by the wall, arranging jars with practiced care. She did not look up immediately when Mrs. Lancombe entered, though her hand paused for a fraction of a second before resuming its work. When she did turn, her expression was composed, almost genial. "I'm glad you could come," she said. "We nearly postponed." "Nearly," Mrs. Lancombe repeated, taking a seat that placed her neither opposite Miss Crowell nor beside her. The position felt carefully neutral. Others arrived in twos and threes. Mrs. Pell, carrying a notebook she never used. Mrs. Bellows, already whispering to someone whose name Mrs. Lancombe did not catch. Two women she recognized only vaguely, residents of lanes she rarely walked. The jam-making circle, despite its domestic purpose, drew attendance unevenly. Some came for instruction, others came to observe. When all were seated, Miss Crowell cleared her throat. "We've had a productive season," she began. Despite the difficulties, a murmur of agreement followed. Difficulties, Mrs. Lancombe thought, was a generous term. Supplies had been scarce, lids unreliable, sugar rationed by habit rather than necessity. Each problem had required adjustment, and adjustment bred opinion. The discussion moved briskly at first. Techniques were exchanged. Complaints aired politely. Miss Crowell listened, occasionally correcting a detail, never raising her voice. Mrs. Lancombe noticed that the jam jars on the table were not for sharing. They were examples, sealed, labeled, untouchable. As the conversation deepened, it shifted subtly. Someone remarked that generosity had its limits. Another suggested that giving away preserves too freely invited waste. A third observed that people did not always appreciate what went into such efforts. Each comment landed lightly, but together they formed a pattern Mrs. Lancombe could not ignore. Miss Crowell's gaze moved around the circle, lingering just long enough on each face to be felt. "We give," she said, "because it is expected. But expectation should not be mistaken for entitlement." Mrs. Lancombe felt the words settle uncomfortably. She wondered who else they were meant for. A pause followed, broken by Mrs. Pell, who spoke with deliberate casualness. "Of course accidents do happen, even with the greatest care." Miss Crowell smiled. "They do, which is why standards matter." The room grew quieter. Mrs. Lancombe became acutely aware of her own breathing, of the slight creak of her chair when she shifted. She understood then that this was not a meeting about jam at all. It was about boundaries, about the quiet authority of those who decided what was given and on what terms. When the meeting ended, there was no formal close. Chairs scraped softly as people rose. Conversations resumed in low tones, reforming into familiar alliances. Miss Crowell remained by the table, speaking to no one in particular. Mrs. Lancombe hesitated, then approached. "It's good to be reminded," she said carefully, "how much attention these things require." Miss Crowell met her gaze. "Attention is everything," she replied. "Without it we invite misunderstanding." They parted without further words. As Mrs. Lancombe left the hall, she felt the weight of what had been said and not said settle upon her. The circle, she realized, was less about preserving fruit than preserving order, and she had, by attending, confirmed her place within it, whether she wished to or not. Mrs. Lancombe noticed the change, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because nothing did. The village continued exactly as before, which in itself suggested adjustment. Doors still opened at the same hours. Greetings were exchanged with familiar warmth, yet conversations now carried a slight hesitation, as though each speaker were allowing space for correction. She encountered it first at the baker's. The woman ahead of her hesitated before ordering, glanced back, then chose differently. The exchange meant nothing, except that it did. Mrs. Lancombe felt the moment brush past her and leave a faint trace. Mild interference, she thought, often disguised itself as courtesy. Inspector Purbright called that afternoon, not to her house but by coincidence at the Green. He greeted her as though they had arranged it, which made the meeting feel intentional without being so. They walked together, neither setting the pace. "People are being helpful," he observed. "They always are," she replied. "Yes," he said, "but help can be directional." She understood what he meant. Since the jam-making circle, advice had appeared unasked. Suggestions about storage, remarks about shelf life, casual warnings framed as concern. No one instructed her directly. They nudged. At home she found a note pushed through the letterbox. Mrs. Bellows had written to remind her that sugar absorbed odors if kept improperly. Mrs. Lancombe folded the note and set it aside without comment. The interference was gentle, almost affectionate, and therefore harder to resist. Later, Mrs. Pell arrived with an apology for speaking out of turn earlier in the week. She did not specify when or how. The apology floated free of event, attaching itself to nothing concrete. Mrs. Lancombe accepted it, and offered tea, aware that she was participating now rather than observing. As they sat, Mrs. Pell mentioned that Miss Crowell had been unwell, then immediately corrected herself to say merely tired. The correction was unnecessary. Mrs. Lancombe noticed that such adjustments were becoming common, as though the village were editing itself aloud. After Mrs. Pell left, Mrs. Lancombe stood at the window, watching the lane. She saw how people slowed as they passed her gate, how they looked without appearing to look. Mild interference worked both ways. She was being guided, but she was also being watched to see whether guidance was required. That evening she moved the jam jar again, not to hide it, but to place it among others she had made herself years before. The gesture felt deliberate. She was reclaiming context. The village valued continuity, so did she. The following morning, Inspector Purbright returned, this time directly. He spoke of nothing urgent. He remarked on the weather, the garden, the way people intervened without admitting it. "It's rarely malicious," he said. "It's habitual." "Habits can be dangerous," she replied. "They can also be revealing." She told him about the notes, the visits, the advice. He listened with interest, as though she were describing a pattern rather than a problem. "Interference," he said, "often points away from the truth. People adjust what they see so they don't have to adjust what they believe." After he left, Mrs. Lancombe felt steadier. The interference no longer irritated her. It clarified. Each suggestion marked a boundary. Each concern revealed an anxiety not her own. By afternoon she began to respond differently. She thanked people and did nothing. She acknowledged advice and ignored it. The village noticed. The nudging slowed. That night, as she prepared for bed, she realized that the habit of mild interference had served its purpose. It had tested her, not to change her behavior, but to see whether she would notice. She had, and noticing, she suspected, was exactly what Inspector Purbright had been waiting for. The bus stop sat just beyond the bend where the hedges dipped, a narrow shelter with a bench polished smooth by years of waiting. Mrs. Lancombe arrived there earlier than she needed to, standing rather than sitting, her handbag held firmly in both hands. The timetable was pinned to the glass, slightly crooked, as it had been for months. Nothing about the place suggested importance, which was why it so often attracted it. She was not alone for long. Mrs. Pell appeared first, breathless despite the short walk, greeting her with a brightness that did not quite settle. They spoke of the weather, of delays, of buses that no longer kept to proper schedules. The conversation hovered safely above anything that mattered. Then Mrs. Bellows joined them, followed shortly by Mr. Dawkins, who stood a little apart, pretending interest in the road. Each arrival altered the arrangement subtly. Mrs. Lancombe felt the shift as clearly as if the ground itself had adjusted. "It's quiet today," Mrs. Pell remarked. "It won't last," Mrs. Bellows replied. They waited. A car passed without slowing. Somewhere behind them a gate creaked. The village gathered itself in these small pauses, offering space for words that would not fit elsewhere. "I heard," Mrs. Bellows said eventually, lowering her voice, "that Miss Crowell hasn't been herself." Mrs. Pell tilted her head. "Oh, just tired, of course," Mrs. Bellows added quickly. "Though people do say exhaustion leads to mistakes." Mr. Dawkins shifted, his shoe scraping the pavement. "Anyone can make one," he said, "especially when they insist on doing everything alone." Mrs. Lancombe said nothing. She had learned that silence at such moments was interpreted as permission. Mrs. Pell leaned closer. "It's funny how things come out," she said. "One person mentions something, and suddenly everyone's noticed it." "Yes," Mrs. Bellows agreed, "as though we were all waiting to be told what to think." They fell quiet again as another villager approached, nodded, and continued past without stopping. The words already spoken seemed to linger in the air, rearranging themselves. Mrs. Lancombe felt the weight of it then, not accusation, not concern, but alignment. The village was adjusting its story, piece by piece, in a place where no one could later be quoted with certainty. "I don't think," she said carefully, "that tiredness explains everything." 3 faces turned toward her. The attention was polite, expectant. "No," Mrs. Pell said after a moment, "but it explains enough." The bus was late. No one remarked on it. Waiting, Mrs. Lancombe realized, was not about transport. It was about opportunity. People said what they could not say elsewhere, trusting the bus stop to absorb it. Mr. Dawkins cleared his throat. "Inspector Purbright's been asking questions," he said. "Has he?" Mrs. Bellows replied. "I thought he was just walking." "Walking's how it starts," Mrs. Pell said. Mrs. Lancombe watched the road. She wondered how many versions of this conversation were unfolding elsewhere, how many careful phrases were being tested and released. By the time the bus finally appeared, rounding the bend with indifferent punctuality, the story had already taken shape. They boarded without further comment. Seats were chosen deliberately. No one sat beside Mrs. Lancombe. As the bus pulled away, she looked back at the shelter, empty again, innocent as ever. What had been said there would travel faster than any bus, she knew, carried by those who believed they had merely waited and talked, and nothing more. By the time Mrs. Lancombe returned from the bus journey, the village had already reached a comfortable understanding with itself. Nothing had been decided openly, yet everything seemed settled. She felt it in the way she was greeted, with warmth that lingered a moment too long, with concern that did not ask questions. Assumptions, she knew, worked best when they felt communal. She unpacked her bag slowly, aware that ordinary gestures now carried a faint significance. At the bottom lay a loaf she did not remember buying, and a pamphlet she had not intended to take. Both had been pressed upon her with insistence disguised as kindness. She set them aside and stood for a moment in the kitchen, letting the quiet assert itself. The jam jar remained on the dresser, unchanged. She noticed that she no longer felt the urge to move it. Its presence had become accepted, like a fact no one argued with anymore. That, she suspected, was part of the difficulty. Later that afternoon, Inspector Purbright arrived without ceremony. He did not sit at once. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the lane as though he were examining something beyond it. "They've decided," he said mildly. "They usually do," Mrs. Lancombe replied. He turned then, watching her closely. "Decisions made without evidence are rarely questioned." She nodded, because questioning them would require admitting they were made. He smiled faintly and sat. "What's the version today?" she told him. "About tiredness, about mistakes, about generosity turned careless." Each detail sounded smaller, spoken aloud, yet together they formed a shape she recognized. It was neat, it was convincing, it required no further effort. "And you?" he asked. "I'm meant to agree," she said, "by not objecting. That's often enough." They spoke then about Miss Crowell, not accusingly but with attention, about her routines, her pride, the way she accepted gratitude as confirmation rather than conversation. None of it was new. What was new was how it had been gathered, selected, arranged. "The assumption," the inspector said, "is comforting. It allows everyone to be right without anyone being responsible." Mrs. Lancombe thought of the bus stop, of the careful phrases offered there, of how easily concern had slipped into certainty. "They're protecting something," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Themselves." When he left, the house felt altered, not by his presence but by his absence. She prepared supper and ate alone, tasting little. The village outside moved with confidence now, the confidence of people who believed they understood what had happened. In the evening, Mrs. Pell called. She did not mention the jam. She spoke instead of Miss Crowell's health, of how burdens accumulated when one insisted on independence. The message was clear enough. Mrs. Lancombe listened politely and offered no correction. Afterwards, she sat by the window and watched dusk settle. She thought of how assumptions formed, not from malice but from convenience. The village preferred explanations that preserved harmony, even if they distorted truth. Before bed, she took the jam jar down at last. She held it carefully, reading the label again. It looked no different. She realized then that the shared assumption was not about poison or accident. It was about certainty. Everyone believed they knew what kind of woman Miss Crowell was, and that belief allowed everything else to follow. Mrs. Lancombe replaced the jar and turned out the light. Tomorrow, she knew, the assumption would deepen, and once deep enough, it would be very difficult indeed to disturb. The reassignment happened without announcement, which was how such things were always done. Mrs. Lancombe noticed it first in the tone of conversations rather than their content. Voices softened when Miss Crowell's name arose, acquiring a sympathetic curve that had not been there before. Concern replaced curiosity. Explanations grew kinder, and as a result, more final. It was not that the village abandoned its earlier assumption. Instead, it refined it, sanding away the sharper edges until responsibility could be placed somewhere safer. Tiredness became strain, strain became circumstance. Circumstance, eventually, became no one's fault at all. Mrs. Lancome encountered this shift at the grocer's. A woman she scarcely knew remarked that preserving was demanding work at any age, then added that one could hardly blame someone for overlooking a detail now and then. The comment floated free of accusation. It asked to be agreed with. Mrs. Lancome inclined her head and said nothing. By midday, the pattern was unmistakable. Miss Crowell was still central to the story, but no longer culpable. The problem, whatever it was believed to be, had drifted outward, attaching itself to process rather than person. Fault was redistributed among unreliable suppliers, inconsistent produce, the general unpredictability of home methods. Everyone bore a little responsibility, which meant no one bore enough. Inspector Purbright called later, finding Mrs. Lancome in the garden. He watched as she straightened a row of plants that did not require it. "They've moved on," he said. "They have," she replied. Without changing direction, he smiled faintly. "That's often the most efficient way." They walked along the path between the beds. Mrs. Lancome spoke of what she had heard, how sympathy had begun to perform the work that suspicion no longer needed to do. The inspector listened, attentive. "Blame," he said, "is tiring. People prefer to set it down once it's served its purpose." "And what purpose is that?" "To reassure themselves that nothing truly dangerous has occurred." She considered this. Even if it has, especially then. The village continued its careful adjustment. A card was sent to Miss Crowell, unsigned but thoughtfully worded. Someone mentioned organizing help with her preserves next season. The suggestion was framed as kindness, though it carried an unmistakable message. Authority once challenged was being gently shared out. Mrs. Lancome watched this unfold with a growing unease. The reassignment was too neat. It explained everything while explaining nothing. Worse, it absolved everyone of the need to look further. That evening Mrs. Bellows visited, bearing a cake she insisted had been baked with too much enthusiasm. She spoke warmly of Miss Crowell, of her dedication, of how admirable it was to persist despite diminishing energy. The praise felt rehearsed. "We all rely on her," Mrs. Bellows said. "Perhaps too much." "Perhaps," Mrs. Lancome agreed. After she left, Mrs. Lancome sat alone, listening to the village settle. The reassignment had brought comfort. People slept better believing the matter resolved. She wondered whether Inspector Purbright felt the same disquiet she did, whether he too sensed that something essential had been misplaced. The next morning brought confirmation. The inspector returned, expression thoughtful. "They've decided it was an accident," he said, "a convergence of small failures." "And you?" she asked. "I think," he replied carefully, "that accidents don't require so much explanation." They stood in the kitchen, the jam jar between them. Mrs. Lancome realized then that blame had not disappeared. It had simply been moved somewhere less visible, where it could not interfere with daily life. Outside, the village carried on, relieved. Inside, Mrs. Lancome felt the quiet certainty that reassignment was not resolution. It was avoidance, practiced with skill. Whatever truth lay beneath had been covered, not buried, and she suspected it would surface again, precisely because it had been so carefully put aside. The jar stayed where Mrs. Lancome left it, neither prominent nor concealed, occupying a space on the shelf that had once held nothing of consequence. She noticed it each time she entered the kitchen, not with alarm but with the steady awareness reserved for things that refused to resolve themselves. Around it, the room returned to habit. Cups were used and washed. Bread was cut. The clock kept time without comment. The village, meanwhile, settled into its chosen understanding. Miss Crowell was spoken of kindly now, with the careful tone reserved for those who had been spared judgment. Help was offered in advance. Advice was given indirectly. No one suggested further inquiry. The matter, as far as most were concerned, had been addressed sufficiently to allow life to continue. Inspector Purbright visited less often. When he did, it was briefly, his manner unchanged but his questions fewer. He observed rather than asked, listening to what people volunteered when they believed themselves finished with a subject. Mrs. Lancombe understood that this too was a form of patience. One afternoon, as she was sorting tins, she discovered a jar she had forgotten she owned. Her own handwriting marked it as Blackberry, several years old. The seal was intact. She held it up, turning it slowly, and felt a small, unexpected pang. Things endured longer than memory allowed. She placed it beside Miss Crowell's jar, noting the differences. The labels, the thickness of the glass, the care taken, nothing there suggested wrongdoing. And yet the comparison altered something. Context, she realized, mattered as much as content. The inspector arrived that evening as light thinned toward dusk. He stood by the shelf, hands clasped behind his back, studying the jars without touching them. "People think the story's finished," he said. "They usually do," she replied. "What remains," he said, "is what they didn't need." She understood. The village had kept what comforted it and set aside what unsettled it. The jar remained because it did neither. It simply existed. They spoke quietly, about how blame had been redistributed until it lost shape, about how certainty had replaced curiosity, about how shelves held what people no longer wished to examine but could not quite discard. Later, after he left, Mrs. Lancombe took down the jar at last. She did not open it. She weighed it in her hands, feeling the solidity of it, the finality of the seal. She thought of Miss Crowell, of pride mistaken for control, of generosity mistaken for safety. None of it required malice to matter. She returned the jar to the shelf and turned off the light. In the dark, the kitchen felt unchanged. The jar remained. So did the knowledge that some things, once placed, waited not for accusation or forgiveness, but for recognition. The village would move on. The shelf would not. In the days that followed, Mrs. Lancombe noticed how easily the shelf became part of the background. Visitors glanced past it, registering jars only as a group, not as individuals. Conversation flowed around it, careful not to settle. It was remarkable how quickly familiarity dulled attention. She wondered whether this was how other things were managed, by remaining visible until no longer seen. She resisted the urge to interfere. There was nothing to correct, nothing to announce. Instead, she watched. At the post office, people spoke with relief about the return of normality. At the baker's, laughter sounded easier. The village congratulated itself quietly for having navigated a disturbance without damage. That satisfaction, she suspected, was premature. Inspector Purbright sent a note rather than calling. It thanked her for her observations and said nothing more. She folded it and placed it in the drawer with other papers she rarely revisited. The investigation, if it could be called that, had concluded not with answers but with acceptance. He, like the village, had recognized the limits of insistence. One evening, Miss Crowell herself appeared at the door. She looked smaller, or perhaps Mrs. Lancombe had adjusted her expectations. They spoke politely. Miss Crowell mentioned rest, mentioned assistance, mentioned plans for next season. She did not mention the jar. When she left, she paused, as though considering whether to look back, then did not. Mrs. Lancombe returned to the kitchen and stood before the shelf. The jars reflected the lamplight dully. She understood then that what remained was not evidence but reminder. The shelf held the residue of a moment when certainty had been questioned briefly before being restored. She left the jar where it was. Some things, she knew, earned their place by refusing to be resolved. In time, the village would forget why it mattered. The shelf would remember. She went to bed that night without turning the jar in her thoughts, which felt like progress of a sort. Sleep came easily. In the morning, the shelf looked the same. That sameness was instructive. Resolution had not altered the physical world, only the stories told within it. Mrs. Lancombe resumed her routines. She baked, she walked, she listened. Occasionally, someone would pause by the shelf and ask about one jar or another. Never that one. She answered as required, supplying facts without emphasis. The village preferred it that way. Weeks later, when the season shifted and the light changed, she noticed dust gathering along the shelf edge. She wiped it away carefully, leaving the jars untouched. Maintenance, she reflected, was not the same as interference. Nothing more was said. Nothing more was needed. What remained on the shelf did its quiet work, reminding no one in particular that certainty had limits, and that even in villages devoted to order, some things endured simply by being left where they were. Mrs. Lancome accepted that as enough. The shelf, the jars, the unasked questions formed a small, stable arrangement. Life continued around it. If truth had not been spoken, it had at least been placed carefully, waiting without complaint. That, she thought, was sometimes the most honest ending possible,